Okay.
Okay. Okay. All right. Parshas Vayeitzei. So, of course, in Parshas Vayeitzei, after Yaakov took the brachas from Yitzchak, which were originally intended for Esav. Esav is determined to kill Yaakov when after Yitzchak passes away, and Rivka is aware of Esav's plan and Esav's intention, and then Rivka also is concerned about who Yaakov is going to marry in view of the fact that Esav married daughters of the Bnei Ches, and she goes to Yitzchak and she says that Katzti b'chayai, and I would not be able to deal with the situation if Yaakov would follow the path chas v'shalom of Esav. And because of this, Yitzchak advises Yaakov to go, or commands him, gives him a bracha, and commands him to go to Lavan in Haran or Kasdim, and to get a wife from his family, from the daughters of Lavan. And the question is, what was the message that these events had for Yaakov? The fact that he's now forced, and it was not something that he chose to do willingly. The situation perhaps compelled it. There is some indication in some of the Mefarshim that when he got to base Cal, so he got the approval of HaKadosh Baruch Hu for his plans to leave. But until he got to base Cal, he did not know that this was the plan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that this was the proper thing. My uncle focused on what is the message. What is the message to Yaakov? That he has to leave Beersheba. Beersheba was what my uncle would call the home, the covenant community. There was the place that there was spiritual security. And now Yaakov, in a sense, is beginning to have doubts in his mind. Maybe the situation, this is how my uncle explains the Medrash Rabbah. Maybe this situation is indicative of the fact that I am not the one who's chosen to continue the Masorah. And he was scared, according to the Medrash Rabbah, both of the Esav and the Lavan. And as some of the Mefarshim point out, and it seems that my uncle understood it that way, although he doesn't explicitly state so, that he was concerned about the influence and the impact that being together with Lavan would have upon him. The influence. And if he, in a sense, as he indicated later on, Esav, that the brachas weren't fulfilled, the impact and the influence that Esav would have upon him, in addition to the physical danger that he was from both of them. And the Medrash Rabbah mentions the Esa Einai El Harim, that's Yaakov, And the Medrash says, my eyes go up to the mountains. And the Medrash says, Hahorim, Hahorim, the parents. And the way my uncle explained it, Yaakov knew that Yitzchak, when Yitzchak wanted to go down to Egypt, he said, God told him, Al Tered Mitzrayim, do not go down to Egypt. Shchon Baretz, Gur Baretz, dwell in the land. So in a sense, he felt that perhaps he was being torn away from the position of being the successor to Avram and Yitzchak. Especially Avram was told at the very beginning that the brachos that were given to him will only be niskayim, will only be fulfilled. Estel Gadol at the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha will only be fulfilled in Eretz Yisrael. And here Yaakov is told, leave Eretz Yisrael. And these doubts were in his mind. But ultimately, according to Medrash Rabbi, he was Boteach B'Hashem, and he put his reliance in God. And it's interesting, though, when he had these doubts, my uncle doesn't mention this, but we could add this based on something my uncle said when Avram went down to Egypt. So it says that when Avram hikriv lavo Mitzrayim. So when Abraham came hikriv lavo Mitzrayim, and my uncle mentioned that when Paro chased the Bnei Yisrael at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf, it says who Paro hikriv. And Rashi points out, the Medrash points out, what is hikriv there? In other words, Paro came very quickly because of his determination, his desire to destroy Klal Yisrael. Seems very strange. Avraham is going down to Egypt, and it's hikriv. He's going quickly. The word hikriv here means the same thing as hikriv there. How are we to understand it? He's leaving Eretz Yisrael. My uncle said that it's possible. He's leaving Eretz Yisrael because of the circumstances of the Rav, of the famine that was in the land. My uncle said that Abraham, and mistakenly so, thought the reason he was being forced, the Ramban says, was actually a mistake on his part. There are those who suggest that the Ramban didn't actually say it. They write Talmud Torah said it. But the simple reading of the Ramban is that way, that Avram was forced to go down to Egypt was a sign for HaKadosh Baruch Hu that in addition to the kiruv that he had to do in Eretz Yisrael, he had to do kiruv outside Eretz Yisrael as well. So he saw it, not just circumstances were making him aware of a mission that he thought was being given. And it was hikriv. So he went down quickly because he wanted to fulfill that mission. But as opposed to the work he did in Eretz Yisrael, and even as opposed to the work he did in the Charan previously, in Eretz Mitzrayim, he had very little influence. He was not successful in his endeavors to make the Egyptians aware of monotheism, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of rejecting idolatry. So, and Yaakov was aware of all this. So he felt that Kiruv could only be done in Eretz Yisrael. Closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu can only be done in the land that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to his ancestors, to Abraham and Yitzchak. And now that he was being forced out of the land, he was feeling as if he was cut off from the heritage of Abraham and Yitzchak. And it's interesting, we could say, the Medrash Rabbi says that many, at first there were a number of stones, me'abnei hamakom, and then all the stones argued figuratively who should be under the head of Yaakov. And the question is, how many stones were there? And there was one opinion in the Medrash, if my memory serves me correctly, that there were 3 stones. And there's another opinion in the Medrash that there were 12 stones. What's the idea behind it? 3 stones obviously represent Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. In other words, it was this fear. The fear of Yaakov was being addressed by the stones, by the 3 stones coming together. That no, you are not being cut off from Avram and Yitzchak. The 3 stones are one. The mission is one. Perhaps each one has a different midah, a different trait to accomplish that mission. But you, like your ancestors, like Abraham and Yitzchak, will be a father of Klal Yisrael. And the heritage will continue through you. And we could say that the 3 stones, the 12 stones, the opinion that says that it was 12 stones, it's talking about the Shvatim. After all, at least 11 of the children, 11 of the boys, I should say, of the male children, were not born in Eretz Yisrael. And people sometimes have a fear that if your children are born in an environment that is not conducive to Torah, they will be lost. There is no hope. Each one will go his own way and do his own thing. And they will cease to be an Am Yisrael, a Jewish nation. So the 12 stones, and it was known that the Shvatim, the nation, will be 12. So the 12 stones became one, indicating to Yaakov that he doesn't have to worry, that he will be the father of Klal Yisrael, the father of the Jewish people. And so, and the truth of the matter is, to a large degree, we suffer from those same doubts. When I say we, I'm talking about our generation. And the same problems existed in Europe. And perhaps because of these doubts, and I'm not finding fault with anybody, many Jews were killed. They weren't able to survive. Yaakov Avinu, when he heard that Esav is coming to attack, he divided them into Shnei Machanos, because into two camps, because one way or another, at least one camp would survive. But there were those who felt, and not without reason, that there has to be only one camp. And everybody was warned not to leave Europe. There is no hope outside Europe. And one cannot deny that the situation in America at that time, from a spiritual perspective, was very dark. People couldn't make a living unless they were Mechal Shabbos. But perhaps, and it's easy to say, standing where I'm standing, perhaps more could have been done. And we face the same dilemma, and here we don't have the same excuses that the Jews of Europe had. People, all of a sudden, they feel that they have to live in cities that are completely Torah-oriented. Okay, that's not so bad. In other words, a person should always seek out, we say in Pirkei Avos, in a place where Torah is vibrant. But we can't count on the situation always allowing that. The problem is that many chinuch institutions today are giving the impression to many that only in particular cities, in particular towns, can your children be brought up devoted to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, devoted to Torah, devoted to Limud HaTorah. And that itself has a negative effect when circumstances, and there will always be circumstances, that make it impossible for individuals to live in those areas. And it's a denial of reality. And so my uncle, the message that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will watch over him, the message that he will continue the Masorah, given at this point that he was leaving Eretz Yisrael, was, do not think, Yaakov, that Torah is dependent on a place. Of course, it's always better to live in Eretz Yisrael. But if circumstances force one to leave Eretz Yisrael, you could still remain loyal to Torah. And this is the unfortunate thing I mention all the time, the Meraglim, Klal Yisrael, when Moshe Rabbeinu was away for 40 days. Meraglim were Roshei B'nai Yisrael Hema, leaders of the Jewish people. But 40 days away from Moshe Rabbeinu, the Miglul changed. And they come back and lead a rebellion against Korach, against Moshe and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And according to some of the Mefarshim, the incident of the Meraglim is what caused Korach to rise up in rebellion. And we do hear about how in certain areas where life is restricted, there are rebellions. People leave, but they're not just leaving the city, they're leaving Torah because they weren't trained that Torah can exist anywhere else. And what do? Those who have children in these cities that are rebellious, they send them away. They send them to another city that the people shouldn't see. Okay, they send them to what you would call yeshivas that deal with these issues instead of keeping them in town. What are you telling them when you send them away? You're telling them you are not part of us. And you can understand when they have this idea, you are not part of us, they feel that they're excluded from the Masorah. They're excluded from Klal Yisrael. Now, this is the way I understand. Of course, my uncle did not say all of this. My uncle understood the message of the circumstances that Yaakov was in. Torah, of course, Eretz Yisrael is best, but Torah could be everywhere. My uncle's expression is, and he used it more than once, Torah can grow even on the moon if we have to be on the moon. Now, and this also was the preparation. Yaakov had to build a community in Mitzrayim, in Egypt later on. In a sense, this was the preparation for that. And then in his dream, Yaakov was told, Haaretz she'asher toshochev aleha. And the Medrash says, the land that you are resting on it, l'chot nena, I will give it to you. And the Medrash says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took all of Eretz Yisrael and folded it underneath Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, our ancestor. My uncle, in the notes that I've seen published, I don't know if he said it that way, he says that it has reference underneath the head of Yaakov. I'm not sure that the Medrash is focusing only the head of Yaakov. And the Medrash says it's like Dalet Amos, something that's close to him in the sense that he has acquisition to it. And the Medrash, so the question is, what was the purpose of this Medrash? And my uncle said that the purpose of this Medrash was in order to address a troubling situation that Yaakov might have sensed through his dream. And the dream spoke about the different exiles. And Yaakov faced a dilemma. During the first Beis Hamikdash, during the first Commonwealth, I take that back, in the first Commonwealth, when Yehoshua brought the Jewish people into Eretz Yisrael, so Yehoshua sanctified the land, and they became required in mitzvahs hatuyas baretz, the mitzvahs of the land, trumos and maestros, tithes of the land, trumos had to be given to the Kohanim. Maestros, all kinds of maestros, Maeserani, Maeser Sheni, all kinds of mitzvos of Tluyos Baretz that are dependent upon the land. But Yaakov became aware that there will be nations that will conquer Israel and that will send the Jewish people back into exile. And the halacha is that the first kibush, the consecration, the sanctification of the land that took place at the time that Joshua conquered the land, that dusha, that sanctity, came to an end, was removed with the Babylonian sending the Jewish people into exile. And to a certain degree, Yaakov was disturbed that how are the Jewish people when they return to Eretz Yisrael? How are they going to re-sanctify the land? Because they're not going to return with an army. Joshua was able to sanctify the land because he conquered the land. But how is he going to re-sanctify the land? So Oretz Hashirat Shochev Aleha, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told them, the land that you're sitting on it, he had reference to the second Commonwealth. Now, my uncle doesn't explain why here all of a sudden we're dealing with the second Commonwealth. But I think we could suggest, according to what my uncle said, that before his dream, Yaakov was concerned about Golus, about the exile, his exile. But he then saw that perhaps his exile was preparation for the exile of future generations. And there are midrashim that say the malachim that went up were the malachim, were the angels who, in a sense, are identified with the nations that are going to conquer the Jewish people, oppress the Jewish people. So he was concerned, how is the Eretz Yisrael, when the Jews return, going to be sanctified? But the Rambam is very interesting. The Rambam says the first Kedusha, the first sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, which was done through conquest, that Kedusha, that sanctity, came to an end with Babylonian exile. However, when the Jewish people went up in the time of Ezra, in the second Commonwealth, so the land was not sanctified through conquest. There was another way to sanctify the land, and that was chazaka. What is chazaka? Chazaka is a demonstration of ownership that manifests itself in the person demonstrating ownership by being on the land. So God took all of Eretz Yisrael and put it under Yaakov Avinu to demonstrate to him that when the Jewish people return, because Yaakov, the dream of Yaakov foretold about Yaakov returning to the land. And Ma'aseh Avo Siman Labanim. So as his focus changed from only exile to return, his focus about future generations also went from exile to return. And Aretz Hashirat Yoshev Aleha Yoshev you could sanctify Israel by having power over the land, and you can sanctify Israel by living in the land. And Yaakov, them, and the sanctification that comes from chazakah, from living in the land. So that sanctification is a permanent sanctification. That's the idea my uncle said, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu put all of Eretz Yisrael underneath Yaakov Avinu. My uncle said Yaakov Avinu's head, in order to let Yaakov Avinu know that he didn't have to worry about the return of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael. On the contrary, that sanctification is greater. Nations conquer nations. England at one time, they said the sun never set on the British Empire, but India was not England. It was part of the British Empire. Military takeover doesn't demonstrate real identification with the land, but living on the land, working on the land, that demonstrates real identification with the land. And it's true, after Joshua captured the land, the Jews lived on the land. But if I can use a word from the Palestinians, that was the continuation of the occupation. It was the continuation. It could be seen, I should say, it could be seen as the continuation of the conquest of the land. So the conquest of Joshua was kitchel l'shaita v'lo kitchel l'asud lavo. The sanctification was not a permanent sanctification, whereas the sanctification of Ezra did not dissipate, did not come to an end with Roman exile. Now, while this is a very beautiful pshat, I had some trouble with it. And that is because the Medrash says, and Rashi cites it, that God folded the land of Eretz Yisrael and put it all underneath Yaakov Avinu. And according to my uncle, this was demonstrative of the chazakah, of the sanctification of the land that will take place as a result of the Jewish people going up in the time of Ezra to the land of Israel at the beginning of the Second Commonwealth, not with armies, but just to reside there. But the Gemara always tells us that Harbe Krachim, there were many areas of Eretz Yisrael in the second Beis Hamikdash, in the Second Commonwealth, that were not sanctified, that apparently the Jewish people either didn't sanctify it or didn't reside in it. So how could we say that Kipel, God folding all of Eretz Yisrael, has reference to the Second Commonwealth? It should say he took part of Eretz Yisrael and put it underneath Yaakov Avinu. Now, but I think we could explain it. Okay, we're already in the month of Elul with something that Reb Chaim said.
We're in Kislev.
Miss Kislev, I'm sorry. The month of Kislev, yeah. The month of Kislev, in the month of Kislev, and the Haftarah of Hanukkah. So I wasn't talking about the Shiva and the Nechemta. Okay. So the at the end of the Haftarah, for the first Haftarah of Hanukkah. So this is in Zcharia. So the Malach appears to Zcharia and he says, Ma taroah, what do you see? Va'omar, vayomer, What do I see? Zechariah says, I see and behold, there's a menorah, a candelabrum, made entirely of gold, with its bowl on its top, and its 7 lamps are upon it. And there are 7 tubes to each of the lamps that are on top. And 2 olive trees. And there were 2 olive trees are near it, one to the right of the bowl and one to its left. And then Zechariah says to the angel, but I don't understand the meaning of this. What are these? And the angel spoke to Zechariah and said, he said, do you know what they are? He said, no. He said, this is the word of Hashem to Zerubbabel, saying, not through armies and not through might, but through my spirit, says Hashem, master of legions. What's going on here? And Reb Chaim said, the 2 olive trees, and there's a medrash that says that represents the Kohen Gadol and the Melech and the king. And the Kohen Gadol and the high priest, I don't like using that word, and the king, they under laboratory conditions, they were appointed with the anointing of special olive oil. But at the end of the time of the first Commonwealth, shortly before the exile, that special oil was hidden, was put away, together with the Aron and together with many other things. So this is what the Navi, Zechariah, didn't understand. In the second Beis HaMikdash, in the second temple, they didn't have this special anointing olive oil. They couldn't anoint the king. And even the Kohen Gadol, the high Kohen, he could not become Kohen Gadol, could not assume the office of Kohen Gadol through anointing of the oil. It was through other means. Ribui Gadim. So the question is, in the second Beis HaMikdash, Zechariah is standing at the doorstep of the second Beis HaMikdash, of the second Commonwealth. And he says, how could I have this prophecy about a king and a Kohen Gadol who are be anointed with the olive oil when the special olive oil was hidden away and it wasn't there during the second Commonwealth? The answer was, Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach, ki im beruchi amar Hashem. Not with chayil, not with military might, not with strength. Will Eretz Yisrael be sanctified this time? But it'll be sanctified through chazakah. But the question is, in the second Beis HaMikdash, there was no olive oil. And the prophecy was given, this is the Pshat of Reb Chaim, I don't know if I mentioned. The second Beis HaMikdash, there was no olive oil to sanctify the special olive oil, to sanctify to sanctify the Kohen Gadol, to appoint the king. So, and Zechariah is standing at the beginning of the second Commonwealth. So the Mar Nevuah is about the second Commonwealth. But the answer is the Kedusha, the sanctification of the second Commonwealth, was lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach. It wasn't through military might. It wasn't through conquest. With the Spirit of God, the returning to the land of Eretz Yisrael. It was through chazakah. Since it was through chazakah, it's permanent. It means it lasts up to and including the time of Mashiach's returning. When Mashiach comes and sanctifies the rest of Eretz Yisrael, it won't be a completely new sanctification. It will be an extension of this sanctification. The Dusha, the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, of the second base of Mikdash, and the sanctity of the third base of Mikdash of Eretz Yisrael, the third commonwealth. That's the same sanctification. So we could suggest that's what my uncle meant. In other words, since it's part and parcel of the same sanctification, so in a sense, that sanctification will be over all of Eretz Yisrael. So Kipla, God folded Eretz Yisrael and put it underneath Yaakov Avinu to tell us that the Dusha of the second base of Mikdash and the Dusha of the third, there will be extra things in the third, but for other reasons, will be the third base of Mikdash, the sanctification of Eretz Yisrael will be an extension. So that's how we can understand what my uncle said. However, the Reb Chaim's explanation is somewhat difficult also, because the oil that deals the oil, certainly about the Kohen Gadol, that deals with the Beis Hamikdash, that deals with the Dusha, the sanctity of the Beis Hamikdash. So what does it have to do with the sanctification of Eretz Yisrael? According to the Rambam, the sanctification of Eretz Yisrael, according to the Rambam, the sanctification of Eretz Yisrael is separate from the Kedusha of the Beis Hamikdash. The Beis Hamikdash, even after the first exile, the temple had its special sanctity that remained. Once King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, sanctified the Beis Hamikdash, it was a permanent Kedusha. What does that have to do with the re-sanctification of the land of Israel in the time of the second commonwealth and going into the third commonwealth? The menorah, that's identified with the temple, not with the land of Israel. Now, it's interesting, the Ravid, he disagrees with the Rambam, and the Ravid's opinion is that there can't be sanctification of Eretz Yisrael, of the Beis Hamikdash, when there is no sanctification of Eretz Yisrael. And the question arises, why is it that way? After all, in the Midbar, in the desert, there was no sanctification of Eretz Yisrael. There was no land of Eretz Yisrael. So the question is, how is it that how could the Ravid say that there can't be sanctification of the Beis Hamikdash unless there's sanctification of Eretz Yisrael? In the desert, there was no sanctification of Eretz Yisrael. It wasn't Eretz Yisrael. So I think we could explain it. Because the Torah tells us the mitzvah of building a Beis Hamikdash. Now, the Rambam's opinion is that even after the temple was destroyed, one could even give korbanos, could give sacrifices in the temple. The sacrifices would not be sacrifices that are given outside of the dusha, because the dusha, the sanctity of the temple, is a permanent sanctity. According to the Rambam, if somebody walks on the site of the Azara today and he's tamei mes, as we all are, he was defiled because of contact with the dead. So it's an isakares, because the sanctity is a permanent sanctification. The Ravid disagrees. And the Ravid says, when there is no sanctity, the Ravid says that certainly during when there is no sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, there can't be sanctification of the Mikdash. And then he says, even if there is sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, Ezra only sanctified it temporarily. He mentions both. The question is, how could he say that the sanctification of the Beis HaMikdash, of the Mikdash, of the sanctuary, is dependent upon sanctification of Eretz Yisrael, when in the Midbar we had the Mishkan that had the sanctification of the Mikdash without the sanctification of Eretz Yisrael? And the answer is because it says the mitzvah of building a Mikdash is va'asuli Mikdash v'shachanti b'socham. Make for me a Mikdash, and I will dwell in their midst. What is the idea of Dushas Haaretz? What is the idea of Dushas Haaretz? The idea of Dushas Haaretz, sanctification of the land, is that the land belongs to the Jewish people. That's from the time of Abraham Avinu. But what is the sanctification of the land? The sanctification of the land is that the land is the property of the Jewish people. And after the first Beis HaMikdash, when the Jewish people went into Babylonian exile, the residence, excuse me, not the property, the residence of the Jewish people, Eretz Yisrael ceased to be the residence of the Jewish people because it was through military conquest. And when the result of that military conquest came to an end, the sanctification also came to an end. But when the Jewish people returned, it was through Chazakah. And once again, Eretz Yisrael became the residence of the Jewish people. But when they went into the exile of Rome, Roman exile, it still remained a residence because it was through Chazakah. It was identified with them. What's the idea? The idea is if I take a trip and I leave my house still remains my residence. So the sanctification, Eretz Yisrael, even after Roman exile began, remained the residence of the Jew. So its Kedusha was a permanent Kedusha. So va'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'socham, you shall make for me a mikdash. The idea is that the mikdash, that the mikdash was built for God to be a neighbor, a resident among the Jewish people. My uncle once pointed out that when David HaMelech asked the Navi for permission to build the Beis HaMikdash, he said, I live in a palace. Why should God be in a tent? In the Mishkan, which was a tent. What was the relevancy of that argument? The relevancy of that argument is that initially we came in, we lived in temporary dwellings. We didn't have big houses. But now God is our neighbor. We live in big houses. HaKadosh Baruch Hu also has to have a house. God has to reside among the Jewish people. When you reside among the Jewish people, in other words, requires to make a sense HaKadosh Baruch Hu is part and parcel of our community. And in the Midbar, in the desert, the Jewish people were encamped around the Mikdash. So it was V'shachanti b'socham. He resided among them. Not just b'metzias, but halachically. God was residing among them because there was Seder HaMachanos. And even when they went into Eretz Yisrael at the very beginning, as they were going in to capture the land for the Jewish people, in sense, the Mishkan was going in with all the Jewish people. And then you had Dushas Aretz, which represented the residency of the Jewish people. So we could say, even according to the Rambam, the mitzvah of making the base, building the Beis HaMikdash, that true, the Beis HaMikdash can exist when there is no sanctity. When Eretz Yisrael is not the residence of the Jewish people. During the 70 years between the two commonwealths, Eretz Yisrael was not the residency of the Jewish people. But, and the Beis HaMikdash was still, the Makom HaMikdash was still holy. But the full mitzvah of having the Beis HaMikdash, in those 70 years, the significance of the Beis HaMikdash was God was waiting for the Jewish people to join him, to join his community. Then we could even suggest that the full mitzvah, Basuli Mikdash v'shachanti b'socham, is only fulfilled. Yes, there is a mitzvah of having a Beis HaMikdash, of the Beis HaMikdash keeping its holiness. But the full mitzvah of having a Beis HaMikdash is only fulfilled so long as the Jewish people are there. So even during the first 70 years, when it ceased to be the residency of the Jewish people, even though the sanctity of the Beis HaMikdash was there, but it was not in the midst of the residency of the Jewish people. And it could be that according to the Rambam, you can only rebuild the Beis HaMikdash when the people are there. The sanctity remains, but the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash is only when it becomes the residency of the Jewish people. Now, so what we could suggest the message to the Navi was it had to do with the Beis HaMikdash, but during the first 70 years of exile, the Beis HaMikdash, there was no v'shachanti b'socham. God did not dwell in their midst. So because of that, the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael is connected, even according to the Rambam, with the sanctity of the Beis HaMikdash. Yes, the Beis HaMikdash is always sanctified, but the full fulfillment of the mitzvah of Asuli Mikdash v'shachanti b'socham is only when the Jewish people return to Eretz Yisrael, when the Eretz Yisrael becomes the residency of the Jewish people. So this is what the Navi was saying. The Navi was talking at the beginning of the Second Commonwealth. So he talks of Dushas HaMikdash, according to Rabbi Chai, Dushas Eretz Yisrael, but it has to do with the Beis HaMikdash also. Now, but I think there is another possible to answer that we could say to the message to explain the message that was given to Yaakov when he was leaving Eretz Yisrael. Now, I've discussed many times the argument between the Rambam and the Ramban, whether the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is counted among the mitzvahs or not. The Ramban's opinion is that it's counted among the mitzvahs. And I mentioned that Eretz Yisrael, even during the first 70 years. So what was the status of Eretz Yisrael? What was the status of the land of Israel before the time of Joshua? Eretz Yisrael provides a special skula, a special aid to those who are buried there. That's why Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov wanted to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. Yaakov especially, he was in Egypt, and he burdened Yosef to rebury him in Eretz Yisrael. What would have been the significance of going to Eretz Yisrael at that point? Not going later. When Yosef went, when Yosef's body was carried at the time of the Exodus. But Eretz Yisrael was Eretz Yisrael even at that time. Why? So the Kaptav Aferach says, because the Dusha, there is a certain sanctity of the presence of God in Eretz Yisrael. And also, there is but Eretz Yisrael also has significance because it was the land that was given to Avraham Avinu for all the Jewish people of all generations, the kinyan, the ownership that the Jewish people as a nation, not as individuals and not as partners, but as a nation have in the land of Israel. And that's why the halacha is that one spouse, I mentioned it previously, one spouse could pressure another spouse to move, not just to Eretz Yisrael, but to Yerushalayim also, because in the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah of living in the land that represents this special relationship between God and the Jewish people. God because of his presence there, and the Jewish people because the land belongs to them. And Yerushalayim has God's presence more than the rest of Eretz Yisrael. So while there's a mitzvah, a required mitzvah to live anywhere in Eretz Yisrael, there's a special mitzvah, not a required mitzvah, to live in Yerushalayim also. It's the same mitzvah. It's just because God's presence is greater over there. Now, I think when you take a look, when Avram goes down to Eretz Yisrael, and when Avram goes to Eretz Yisrael the first time, immediately after he comes to Eretz Yisrael, Vayirav Baretz, there is a famine in the land, and Avram has to go down to Egypt. And the question is, why is it that Avram was told by God to go to Eretz Yisrael shortly before he had to leave Eretz Yisrael and go down to Egypt? What was the purpose? According to the Rambam, it's one of the Asar Nisyonos, it's one of the tests. But the Nisayon was to teach us, future generations, a lesson. What was the lesson we had to know? But the lesson we had to know was that the lesson that we had to know was that Eretz Yisrael, that a Jew has to have a relationship with Eretz Yisrael even when he is in Chutz La'aretz, even when he is in outside the land of Israel. And Avram, when he left Eretz Yisrael, the main focus was, true, he built Mizbechos there, but you don't see an emphasis. When he built the Mizbechos, he built the Mizbeach, he built the altars there, because he was told he will have the land. The land will be his. It will be for his future descendants. He was to plead on behalf of his children that might be at war at that time and find military difficulties. Yaakov, we see a different story. Yaakov, of course, he understood the significance of Eretz Yisrael as the place that was given to him for his future descendants. But this place is going to be a house of God. It's the entranceway to the land of Israel. To Avram, when Avram left, it was to impress upon Avram the importance that even the Jew outside Eretz Yisrael has to have a relationship with the land of Israel when he's outside Eretz Yisrael. But for Yaakov, the message emphasized not just that the land will be his. It was Sulam Mutzav Artza V'Rosha Magia Hashemayma. It was the idea that Eretz Yisrael is the place, of course, Yerushalayim, but Yerushalayim is indicative of what's true about Eretz Yisrael everywhere. As the Kafta V'Ferach says, there's Dusha Shechina. So we have to know when we're outside Eretz Yisrael, we have to look forward to returning to Eretz Yisrael. We have to work on behalf of Eretz Yisrael. What's our heter to live in Chutz La'aretz? According to Ramban, but we could suggest that part of the heter is because the mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is not just living in Eretz Yisrael, but giving the Jewish people the ability to live and to be in control of Eretz Yisrael. That's part of the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. So we have to have a relationship with Eretz Yisrael. We have to have a relationship with Eretz Yisrael, not just because it was the land given to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but because it's the land that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence is apparent there. And that represents our special relationship. The two halachas together represents our special relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Even Hazo Shesher Samti Matseva Yiyeh Beis Elokim. This, and it's very interesting, there is a machlokes between the Shach and Rabbi Yisrael Mishklov, Parshas Shulchan. If somebody has a choice between giving money to the poor of his city or to the poor of Eretz Yisrael, who gets priority? So the Shach says, Aniye Ircha, the poor of your city get priority. Rabbi Yisrael Mishklov, who, by the way, was in charge of raising the funds for the poor of Eretz Yisrael, he suggests the possibility, he's not cholik on the Shach outwardly, but he suggests the possibility that it could be that Ani Eretz Yisrael come first, the poor of Eretz Yisrael come first, because he says with supporting the poor of Eretz Yisrael, you're not only mekayim the mitzvah of tzedakah, but you're mekayim the mitzvah yishuv haaretz, of dwelling in the land that Klal Yisrael, that the Jewish people dwell in the land. So, and it's interesting, not many years ago, a couple of years ago, I remember the Rosh Yeshivas and the Rabbanim of Eretz Yisrael signed a letter that priority has to be given to the poor of Eretz Yisrael. And Rabbi Yashiv signed on that letter. I didn't see that the Rosh Yeshivas of the United States signed on that letter. Okay, listen, whatever. Anyway, but I'm not chas v'shalom, not to put the Rabbi Shlomo Shklov only mentioned it as a suffix, as a possibility. But in his commentary on the Parshas Shulchan itself, it seems that he gives preference to Ani Eretz Yisrael, but in his commentary, he seems to have a suffix about it. So that there's a mitzvah. So this was God appeared to Yaakov at this point. He appeared to Yaakov at this point when he's leaving. And he emphasizes that your Eretz Yisrael is your place. You are the successor. The Medrash of the three stones coming together. Eretz Yisrael will be yours. But you should know, but why am I telling it to you now when you're leaving? In order to emphasize to you that when you are in Chutz La'aretz, you have a relationship with Eretz Yisrael. You have to look forward to going back to Eretz Yisrael, and you have a responsibility for Eretz Yisrael. And that's what we have to know, that we have to have a responsibility for Eretz Yisrael. I just want to suggest, regard to the question of Kaflo, another teretz, to why I mentioned my uncle's pshat, God folded all of Eretz Yisrael. I've mentioned it before. We say, Torah says, "V'yarashtem es haaretz v'yashavtem ba." You shall take possession of the land and you shall dwell therein. Why? Because I gave you the land to take possession of it. And I think Dor Chaim asked the question: You shall conquer the land and dwell in it, because I gave it to you to take conquest of it. Just what's the idea behind it? But Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is not just the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. We have to live in Eretz Yisrael because the mitzvah of conquering Eretz Yisrael is not to conquer it for one day and then to give it back, not to conquer it for 1 year and then to give it back. The mitzvah is to conquer it for generations, because we are the representative of the Jews of all the generations, both before us and after us, and we're conquering it for them as well. So the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, when you just conquer and you take possession through military might, so you don't know how long you're going to have it, but you reinforce that conquest by residing in the land. Taking possession, you have possession, I shouldn't say conquest. Having possession of the land is only reinforced not just by power, lo b'chayo v'lo b'koach, but Beruchi Amar Hashem. And we see the lands that were given back for the most part were lands, for the most part, there were exceptions that the Jews really weren't allowed to settle. If we want to have true conquest, true control over the land, it has to be because HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave it to us to have it in our possession, and living in Eretz Yisrael gives us some assurance that the land will remain with the Jewish people. Okay.
Hey, please put questions in the chat.
That's why. Oh, that's one thing. That's why Yaakov Avinu's being on the Eretz Yisrael, that represents the idea that we have to dwell in all of Eretz Yisrael, not just in part of Eretz Yisrael. Okay.
If anyone has questions, please put it in the chat. One question is, for Eretz Yisrael to be the residents of the Jewish people, does that mean all of us need to resign? How did that work in the time of Ezra?
No, it doesn't have to be all of us. The nature of the Kedusha is different, and you didn't have, according to most Shitas, the land divided up among the Shvatim and all that. But the Kedusha, there was Kedusha, even though there wasn't all of the Jewish people there.
Does it need the majority?
No, you don't need a majority. That's the Rambam points that out. You didn't have Bias Kulchan there.
Well, some Kulchan holds some of each Shevet, right?
Okay, that's a discussion. That's a separate issue.
If anyone else has a question, please put it in the chat.
All right. They say the war, some people from each Shevet there at the time, some of the Rishonim pointed out, I think Rabbi Natan.
There's a reason that your uncle said that it was folded up under his Yaakov's head and not under his heart.
I don't know why he said that. I wasn't questioning the body. I was questioning because the Medrash seems to say his whole body, and the way they wrote over the notes. I don't know that my uncle said it that way, but it could be my uncle was talking about the Evan that was underneath his head. So somehow whoever took the notes might have confused it. I don't know. But the way the notes were written in English, now it's true if it had been written in Hebrew. So my father once told me that Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky said that both the heart and the brain can be called Lev. But it was written in English and it said the head.
Your father actually said that maybe later in the Bava Basra Shiurim.
He said in many shiurim, he said it.
Okay, there's no other questions here. So thank you, everyone. So the follow-up, it doesn't have any connection with Esav's head being buried in Marza Machpelah.
No, I don't think so.
Okay,
Let's just say I'm not aware. First of all, I don't know that my uncle said that. So I don't know.